What the hell happens when a silver-spooned, Botox-browed Karen decides to steal a black woman's first-class seat? Nothing good. But what happens when that black woman, the one she just dismissed like a piece of trash, secretly owns the entire damn airline? Well, that is when you get a front-row ticket to the most glorious, catastrophic, and soul-satisfying self-destruction you will ever witness. You think you have seen privilege get checked before? You have not seen anything yet. So buckle up, because what you are about to hear is the brutal, real-time implosion of a woman whose mouth wrote a check her platinum status could not even begin to cash. And before we dive into the beautiful carnage, do me a solid. Smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You have just landed on Black Crown Chronicles, and we do not just tell stories here. We serve justice, hot and unfiltered. You are not going to want to miss a single delicious second of this. Inside Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3, the air was thick with the usual symphony of chaos. The frantic roar of boarding calls, the squeal of luggage wheels on polished linoleum, and the low, anxious hum of thousands of people running from something and toward something else. Amidst this river of humanity, in the gilded cage of the first-class boarding lounge, Celine Monroe stood like a rock in the current. She was a masterpiece of controlled power. Her presence was not loud, it was heavy. It carried the quiet, gravitational pull of old money and earned authority. She wore a bespoke obsidian blazer, the kind of garment that costs more than a used car, draped over a simple silk shell. A single heavy gold bangle was her only jewelry, and her hair was cut in a severe, elegant style that framed a face built from strong lines and unwavering eyes. To the untrained observer, she was just another successful businesswoman, sharp and anonymous. But they could not see the truth. They could not see that she was not just a passenger on Ascension Airways Flight 928 to San Francisco. She was the throne. She was the unseen, unheard-of majority shareholder and chairwoman of the entire goddamn airline. The crisp paper of her boarding pass felt cool in her hand. Seat 2A, a window seat, the best seat in the premium cabin, the one she always reserved. But as she stepped onto the aircraft, her eyes fell upon 2A, and a knot of ancient, weary frustration tightened in her gut. A woman was already there. She was the physical embodiment of a certain kind of suburban entitlement. Her blonde hair was a helmet of flawless, aggressive styling. A ridiculously overpriced Hermes Birkin bag was perched on the adjacent armrest like a territorial gargoyle. This was Whitney Ashford, an Ascension Airways Platinum Elite member, heir to a Midwest real estate fortune, and a woman who had never been told no in her entire pampered life. Whitney glanced up from her diamond-encrusted phone, her icy blue eyes flicking over Celine with a dismissal so practiced it was almost an art form. It was a look that sized up, categorized, and discarded Celine in less than a second. "Oh," Whitney said, her voice a weapon wrapped in velvet. "I think there's been a mistake. You must be in the wrong seat." Celine's tone was dangerously even, a flat sea before a tsunami. "I don't believe so. This is 2A." She held up her boarding pass, the evidence clear and indisputable. Whitney let out a small, condescending laugh. It was the kind of laugh designed to rally unseen allies and make Celine feel like the one causing a problem. "Oh, honey, don't be difficult. I'm already settled in. Why don't you go find your real seat? I'm sure the flight attendants can find you something more suitable." That word, suitable, hung in the recycled cabin air like a toxic gas, a slap that landed without touching skin. Nearby, a businessman in 3B suddenly found his newspaper fascinating. A young mother in 4C instinctively pulled her toddler closer. A few passengers leaned forward, their faces masks of feigned indifference that barely concealed their ravenous curiosity. Everyone knew this ritual. It was the quiet, brutal interrogation of belonging. The unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" Celine took a slow, deliberate breath, caging the inferno that threatened to erupt in her chest. She had heard 1,000 variations of this poison her entire life. In the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Yale Law, in polished boardrooms filled with doughy, pale men who called her articulate, as if it were a shocking revelation. Even at charity galas where she was the damn keynote speaker. It was always the same coded disbelief, the same fundamental message. "You do not fit the picture of power I hold in my head." She held out the boarding pass again, her hand as steady as stone. "This is my seat." Whitney did not even bother to look. She was too busy smoothing the folds of her pashmina wrap, a gesture of performative boredom. She tilted her head with an exaggerated sigh meant to convey immense patience in the face of idiocy. "Listen, I have been flying Ascension for years. I'm Platinum Elite. I know how this works. I'm sure the crew can sort this out and find you a nice spot further back." Further back. The implication was as subtle as a brick to the face. Whitney had absolutely no idea. She had no idea the woman standing before her, the woman she was trying to shoo away like a stray dog, could liquidate Whitney's entire world with a single quiet phone call. She did not know that the reservation system that printed her precious ticket was running on servers Celine had personally approved for purchase. She had no idea that the very plane they were sitting on was part of a fleet expansion financed by Celine's family trust. The tension in the first-class cabin was now thick enough to chew. A flight attendant, a young woman named Marissa with a name tag polished to a high shine and a smile stretched just a little too tight, scurried over. Her uniform was crisp, her professionalism a fragile shield. She glanced from Celine's stoic face to Whitney's smug one, and then she made the suggestion that made Celine's stomach clench into a cold, hard fist. "Perhaps, Miss Monroe," Marissa began, her voice a desperate plea for peace, "you'd be willing to take another seat. We have 3C available. It would just help us get everyone settled and depart on time. What happens next will shake you to your core. Because this was never, ever just about a seat. This was about a lifetime of slights. This was about dignity. This was about a queen refusing to bow in her own goddamn castle." Celine studied Marissa, seeing not malice but weakness. The younger woman was terrified, following the path of least resistance, defaulting to the age-old script of asking the black passenger to accommodate, to adjust, to make things easier for everyone else. It was a dance Celine knew intimately, and she was done dancing. She lowered her voice to a calm, chilling whisper that cut through the cabin's murmur. "Why?" she asked, locking eyes with the flight attendant. "Should I be the one to move when my boarding pass says 2A? Marissa flinched. She stammered, glancing nervously at Whitney, who simply smiled that sweet, poisonous smile as if the matter was already decided in her favor. Unseen by the flight crew, 3 rows back, a young man named Dominic adjusted the angle of his phone. He was a citizen journalist, a college kid with a small but fiercely loyal following on his channel, Black Crown Chronicles. He was already live streaming. His caption read, "Privilege on full display on Ascension Flight 928, you won't believe this." The camera held with discreet steadiness captured it all. Celine's unshakable calm, Whitney's dismissive smirk, Marissa's panicked diplomacy. Within moments, the comment section began to scroll. A slow trickle at first, then a flood. "Oh, hell no, not this again. Stay strong, queen. Don't you dare move. Who does that blonde think she is? Let's see who's really in charge here. Let's date." Celine felt the familiar hot flare of righteous anger, but she kept it buried beneath years of hard-won discipline. She thought of the board meetings where old white men had patronizingly dismissed her ideas, only to praise the exact same point when it was repeated by a male colleague soon after. She thought of the magazine journalist who had once asked if she was really the chairwoman or just a figurehead for diversity. This moment in this cramped metal tube hurtling through the sky was no different. A complete stranger had looked at her skin, and made a judgment. "You do not belong here." But Whitney did not know. Oh, she really, truly did not know. Celine slowly, deliberately folded her boarding pass. She slid it back into the inner pocket of her blazer and straightened her spine, seeming to grow an inch taller. Her voice, though still quiet, resonated through the entire cabin, low, clear, and utterly final. "I'm not moving. This is my seat." The silence that followed was electric, a palpable thing. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly staring. Phones were angled not so discreetly. Even the cockpit door cracked open a few inches as word of the standoff reached the pilots. Whitney's blue eyes narrowed, the mask of sweet gentility finally dropping to reveal the ugly, raw entitlement beneath. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "I don't know what kind of game you're trying to pull, but it's not going to work. People like you don't usually get to sit in first class. Everyone here knows it." A collective sharp intake of breath rippled through the cabin. It was as if she had detonated a small bomb. Dominic's live stream chat exploded, the viewer count leaping upward in seconds. Comments scrolled faster than he could possibly read. "She did not just say that. Clip it. Clip it now. Racist caught in 4K. Unbelievable. Ascension Airlines, you better handle this. Where is the captain?" Celine's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of fury and pain. But her face remained a mask of composed marble. She had spent a lifetime, an entire damn lifetime, preparing for moments exactly like this one. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping over the cabin, meeting every watching eye without flinching. Then she looked back at Whitney, who sat there, smug and unrepentant, absolutely certain that her platinum elite status was an unshakable shield of power. But there was something Whitney Ashford did not know. There was a secret hiding in plain sight, and the woman she just tried to put in her place was about to burn her entire world to the ground without raising her voice above a whisper. The silence after Whitney's words, "People like you," was heavier than the plane itself. The phrase, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who has never been challenged, hung in the air, sickening and sharp. Even passengers who had been trying their best to ignore the confrontation froze, their magazines lowered, their headphones pulled off. Celine Monroe did not flinch. She simply stood beside seat 2A, a statue of defiance carved from grace and steel. The murmur started in the front and rippled backward, a wave of shock and disgust. An older black couple in row 4 exchanged a look, not of surprise, but of weary, painful recognition. A young professional in 3C, who had been discreetly recording, now lifted his phone openly, his thumb hitting the share button. This was no longer a minor dispute. It was a public spectacle, a raw display of prejudice high above the earth. Whitney, sensing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere but misreading it entirely, doubled down. "Oh, please," she scoffed, a theatrical roll of her eyes. "Don't try to make this a scene and embarrass yourself. I have flown this airline for years. Platinum Elite. I always get a window seat on the left side. It's practically my reserved spot. They can find you somewhere else." Marissa, the young flight attendant, stepped forward again, her face pale. Her training manual had no chapter for this. "Ma'am," she said, her voice wavering as she addressed Whitney. "Her boarding pass is for this seat. We really need to resolve this." "Then resolve it," Whitney snapped, her voice losing its velvety coating and turning sharp. "Move her." Celine turned her head slowly, her gaze falling upon Marissa with the weight of a judge's gavel. Her tone was still calm, but it was the calm of a deep, cold ocean. "What you are suggesting," she said, her words precise and devastating, "is that the passenger who followed the rules should surrender her rightful place to accommodate the passenger who is breaking them. That is not resolution. That is rewarding entitlement." The truth of the statement landed hard. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. The woman in seat 4C let out a quiet but firm, "That's right." The young professional in 3C nodded, his phone still recording. "And I have to pause here because this is the moment of truth, is it not? What would you do in Celine's shoes? The crew, the entitled passenger, the sheer awkwardness of the situation. All of it pushing you to just give in, to take the other seat and make the problem go away. Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's see where the real ones stand. And if you are just joining us, you picked a hell of a time. Hit that subscribe button, because this powder keg is about to blow sky high." Whitney, sensing the crowd's sympathy slipping away from her like sand through her manicured fingers, tried to regain control. She tilted her head, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Why are you making such a fuss? You're only making yourself look unreasonable. People like me, we understand how the world works." A ghost of a memory flickered behind Celine's eyes. An investor telling her she should bring a male partner to the next meeting to add credibility. The smirks across conference tables when she, a black woman, corrected the financial projections of a man twice her age. Each slight was a tiny cut, a scar that had, over the years, formed an impenetrable suit of armor. Her voice dropped, becoming low and measured, each word a carefully placed stone. "Dignity matters more than convenience. If I must choose between the two, I will choose dignity every single time." The cabin was silent. Whitney, however, pressed on, her arrogance a runaway train. "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded, a classic, desperate gambit. Celine allowed a beat of silence to hang in the air, and then a faint, dangerous smile touched her lips. "No," she said softly, "but you are about to find out who I am." It was not a threat, it was a prophecy. 3 rows back, Dominic leaned closer to his phone, whispering to his now exploding audience. "The chat is going insane. People are tagging Ascension Airlines. They're tagging news outlets. This isn't just about a seat anymore. This is about all of us who have ever been made to feel small." What do you guys think? Should she give in or hold the line? She give in? The chat flooded with a unified roar. "Hold the line, never back down. She represents all of us, and that is exactly why we created Black Crown Chronicles. Because when arrogant entitlement collides with hidden righteous power, the explosion does not just shake one room, it shakes the whole damn system." Marissa looked desperately toward the cockpit. Torn between protocol and her own conscience, Whitney, seeing her hesitation, folded her arms in triumph. "Honestly, you're just causing trouble for everyone. If you understood how premium travel works, you'd know that flexibility is key. Sometimes people like you should just be grateful for the opportunity to be here at all." A collective gasp. A man in row 5 muttered, "Oh, she's done now." Another passenger, a woman in a business suit, raised her phone, no longer even pretending to be discreet. Celine's breath was steady, but inside a lifetime of suppressed rage was rising like magma. She heard her mother's voice in her head, a memory from long ago after a teacher had unfairly disciplined her. "When they try to make you small, you stand up so tall they can't see the top of you." And she did. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her eyes swept the cabin, and she was no longer just a woman defending a seat. She was a mirror reflecting every silent injustice, every casual dismissal, every infuriating slight that every single person in that cabin had ever witnessed or endured. Behind her, Dominic's screen continued to climb. On the ground, alerts were starting to ping on the phones of social media managers and journalists. Hashtags were forming organically like crystals in a super-saturated solution. Seat for dignity. People like you. The spark had escaped the confines of the aircraft. Whitney, oblivious, decided to escalate. Fine, she snapped, her face tightening with fury. Let's get the captain out here. We'll see who he believes. Her finger jabbed the flight attendant call button, and the chime echoed through the tense cabin like a ringside bell signaling the next round. Marissa scurried into the cockpit. Celine closed her eyes for a brief second, centering herself. She could feel the eyes of the world beginning to fix upon her, channeled through the tiny lens of a young man's phone. For the first time in her meticulously private career, she was not the untouchable chairwoman hidden behind press releases and corporate firewalls. She was a black woman in real time, standing her ground against bigotry with the world as her witness. The cockpit door latch clicked open. The captain was about to step out. The stakes had just escalated from one seat to the reputation of an entire airline. Justice, visibility, and billions of dollars in market capitalization were now on the line, and this was only the beginning. The cockpit door swung open with a decisive click, and Captain Harlan Voss stepped into the cabin. He had the look of a man who had spent decades being the calmest person in any room. Silver at the temples, a jawline that seemed carved from granite, and a voice honed by years of reassuring passengers through turbulence. But the storm he walked into now was not one of weather or mechanics. It was entirely, violently human. "Good afternoon," he began, his tone the practiced, firm politeness of ultimate authority. "I'm told we have a seating discrepancy that's holding up our departure." Whitney Ashford straightened up instantly, her face masterfully rearranging itself into a mask of a poised, deeply wronged victim. "Captain, thank God you're here," she gushed. "There's been some sort of mix-up. I requested the seat in advance. I'm a Platinum Elite member. I've been loyal to this airline for years. This woman," she gestured toward Celine as if presenting a piece of contaminated evidence, "is making a terrible scene and refusing to be the least bit reasonable." Celine remained silent, a pillar of composure. She watched the captain, watched the passengers, feeling the subtle shift of alliances and judgments in the cabin. A few rows back, Dominic's phone captured every micro-expression, every nuance. The internet was a jury, and court was in session. Captain Voss turned his authoritative gaze to Celine. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Without a word, Celine handed it to him. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing slightly. "Seat 2A, Monroe, Celine." He then looked back at Whitney. "Mrs. Ashford, and yours?" Whitney's polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered, producing a slightly crumpled slip from her Birkin. "It says 2C, she admitted. "But I specifically requested a window seat on the left side when I booked. It must be a system glitch. Surely for a Platinum Elite member, we can sort this out without disrupting the entire flight." Her words were soaked in a syrup of civility. But the underlying assumption was clear. Her status should override the rules. She expected the captain, a fellow member of the unofficial club of authority figures, to side with her. She had seen it happen 1,000 times before, the world bending ever so slightly for people like her. Captain Voss let out a slow, weary sigh. "Mrs. Ashford, your assigned seat is 2C. This seat," he gestured to 2A, "rightfully belongs to Ms. Monroe." A few quiet gasps of relief fluttered through the cabin. For a moment it seemed resolution was at hand, but then the captain, a man programmed for de-escalation and on-time departures, added the fatal words. "That being said, in situations like this, our priority is to get airborne. We sometimes need to find a compromise. Perhaps Ms. Monroe would be willing to accept seat 3C so we can all be on our way." The air in the cabin did not just freeze, it shattered. Celine lifted her chin, her eyes locking onto the captain's with an intensity that made him physically recoil. "Let me be sure I understand you, Captain," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "Your proposed compromise is for the person with the correct, valid ticket to surrender her seat to reward the person who is refusing to move from a seat that isn't hers. Is that Ascension Airways policy?" A low murmur of agreement rumbled through the passengers. The older black man in row 4 nodded emphatically. This was it. This was the moment the mask of institutional authority slips to reveal the face of ingrained bias. It was not about malice, it was about the system's default setting. Whitney, sensing her opening, pounced. "You see," she chirped, her voice dripping with vindication, "even the captain understands the need for a little flexibility. Surely you can just take the other seat, and we can all move on with our day." Her triumph was palpable, but it was dangerously premature because Celine Monroe did not yield. She had yielded her time, her energy, her peace of mind in countless other rooms, at countless other tables. But not here. Not today. Not in her own damn house. Her voice remained calm, but every syllable was a perfectly sharpened dart. Captain, allow me to ask you a direct question. At what point does a request for flexibility become an act of discrimination? When a white passenger illegally occupies a seat and the black passenger with the legitimate ticket is asked to be the one who moves. What precisely do you call that? The question hung in the air, cracking the foundation of the captain's authority. He was trapped between fairness and habit, between doing what was right and doing what was easy. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air, but before he could formulate an answer, another voice cut through the tension. Excuse me. All heads swiveled. A woman in row 3 with salt and pepper hair and a press badge clipped to her blazer was sitting up straighter. Elena Vargas, she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of her profession. Senior correspondent for the Washington Post. I've been recording this entire interaction on my phone, and I can tell you exactly what it looks like from a legal perspective. A potential civil rights violation occurring in real time on your aircraft. Whitney's face turned to the color of chalk. You can't record me. This is private. Elena Vargas gave a short, sharp laugh. Ma'am, when an act of public discrimination occurs in a place of public accommodation, like an airplane, it is the opposite of private. And when it happens in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom are also recording, it becomes a matter of public record. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with her notes. The hum in the cabin surged. Phones were now lifted openly, defiantly. The pretense of privacy was gone. This was a public trial. What happens next will change everything, because power is about to shift in a way Whitney Ashford could never in her wildest nightmares have conceived. Her voice rising shrill with panic, Whitney spat, "This is absolutely ridiculous. You people are blowing this completely out of proportion. You people." The bomb had been detonated. Gasps, disbelieving mutters. On his live stream, Dominic leaned in, whispering urgently, "Did you all hear that? She said you people. The internet has the receipts." His chat feed became a waterfall of rage. Caught in 4K, it's over for her. Ascension Airlines is done. You people is already trending. Passengers who had remained silent were now openly staring at Whitney with expressions of pure disgust. The older couple in row 4 slowly shook their heads. A young man whispered to his seatmate, "She just canceled herself. Live on camera." Captain Voss looked visibly shaken. He was a pilot, not a crisis manager, and he knew the catastrophic weight of those two words. He turned toward Whitney, his voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Ashford, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position here. This is not going to end the way you think it is." But entitlement, like a cornered animal, rarely retreats. It attacks. "I will not be lectured by you or anyone else," she shrieked. "I have spent more money on this airline than most of you make in a year. I deserve some respect." And that was when Celine spoke again. Her voice was almost a whisper, yet it silenced the entire cabin. "Respect isn't purchased with loyalty points, Mrs. Ashford. It is earned by how you treat the human being standing right in front of you." A profound hush fell. Even the low hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to quiet. Elena Vargas was typing furiously, the headline already forming in her mind. Dominic's viewer count continued to climb. Clips of you people were already racing across platforms, edited with captions screaming, "Karen has meltdown at altitude." The viral spark had become a raging inferno. Celine remained standing, her composure a silent, powerful rebuke to the chaos. But inside, the gears were turning. It was not yet time to reveal her identity. That was the ace up her sleeve. For now, she would let the ugly truth of the situation play out, documented and broadcast for the entire world to see. Still, she allowed herself one small, almost imperceptible gesture, a hint of the power she held in reserve. She pulled out her phone, a sleek, custom-designed device. Her thumb moved across the screen with quiet, fluid precision. To the other passengers, it just looked like a woman sending a text message. But those who would later dissect the footage frame by frame would wonder, what was she doing? Who was she contacting? Why did her calm never, ever break? It was the first breadcrumb, a clue that Celine was more than she appeared, that she was playing a different game on a much, much higher level. Whitney, reading the gesture completely, scoffed. "Go ahead, text your friends. It won't change the fact that you're in my seat." But the look in Celine's eyes, cool, calculating, and patient, told a very different story. And in that silent, knowing gaze, the balance of power in the cabin, and indeed in the world outside, had already irrevocably shifted. Captain Voss, now sweating under the cabin lights, ran a hand over his jaw. He was acutely aware that any decision he made would be scrutinized by millions. The presence of a Washington Post correspondent, the dozens of recording phones, Dominic's viral live stream. It all meant this story was no longer contained within the fuselage. He cleared his throat, his voice strained. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to consult with our operations center on the ground. Please remain seated. Hadi made a hasty retreat back into the cockpit, leaving a buzzing hive of passengers in his wake. Whitney tried to reclaim her authority. See, he's going to sort this out. They'll move you, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. But the cabin was no longer looking at her. All eyes were on Celine, whose profound calm had become the gravitational center of the entire drama. And far beyond the cabin, the world was already choosing a side. By the time Captain Voss had closed the cockpit door, the hashtags were trending globally. Seat for dignity. Celine Monroe. You people. Threads were being populated with eyewitness accounts. Reels looped Whitney's most damning words. Platforms were already flooded with skits and parodies. Celine Monroe, still silent, still composed, had become an icon of quiet resistance without the world even knowing her true name. The stakes had grown exponentially. What began as a stolen seat had morphed into a referendum on race, privilege, and corporate responsibility, all playing out live, and the verdict was just beginning to roll in. The cabin remained suspended in a state of brittle quiet after Captain Voss's retreat. It was not peace, it was the charged stillness before a lightning strike. Passengers were not just whispering now, they were scrolling, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens, watching the story of their own flight unfold on the internet in real time. Outside the aircraft, the storm had broken its cage and was raging across the globe. On social media, Dominic's livestream had shattered previous records. The hashtags were not just trending, they were dominating the global conversation. Ascension Airlines and Whitney Ashford were trending for all the wrong reasons. News organizations, smelling blood, were already dispatching crews to O'Hare and SFO, anticipating the flight's arrival. The ripple effect had become a tidal wave, and it was crashing directly into the glass and steel headquarters of Ascension Airways in downtown Chicago. Inside the company's sprawling high-tech operations center, the War Room, the day had been routine until a junior analyst tasked with monitoring social media sentiment saw the tag. His eyes widened. He clicked, and his blood ran cold. He recognized the distinct pattern of the first-class seat upholstery, the company logo on Marissa's uniform, the unmistakable face of Whitney Ashford, one of their most notoriously demanding high-value customers. Within moments, the phones of every executive on the C-suite floor began to buzz in a frantic, unified chorus. Links were shared, each one a nail in the coffin. Platinum passenger's racist tirade goes viral. You people heard around the world. Ascension captain asks black woman to give up seat. The head of corporate communications, a man named Brenton Hale, burst into the war room, his face ashen. Where is the incident report? Who the hell logged this? He bellowed. Silence. No one had, because according to official channels, nothing had happened yet. The flight was still on the tarmac, but the internet had already held the trial, passed judgment, and scheduled the execution. This was not just about one passenger anymore, it was about the perceived soul of the entire airline. Back on the plane, Whitney, sensing her power crumbling, tried one last desperate maneuver. She leaned across the armrest, her voice a low, threatening hiss meant only for Celine. You're making this so much worse for yourself. All this attention, it will ruin you. Do you honestly think anyone important is going to side with you after you caused a delay and made a public scene? Celine's eyes, calm and clear, met hers. Her reply was a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the silent cabin. It isn't me this attention is ruining. Dominic's microphone caught it. The line was clipped and recaptioned within seconds, replayed tens of thousands of times. It isn't me this attention is ruining. The comments erupted. Ice cold, a masterclass in power, she's not wrong. Viewers saw it not as defiance, but as strategy. She was playing chess while Whitney was flipping the checkerboard. At Ascension headquarters, panic was metastasizing into full-blown corporate terror. The chief operations officer was screaming into a phone. Get me Voss on the cockpit line now. I need to know what the hell is happening on my aircraft before this is on CNN. A young manager, trembling, stammered, Sir, it already is. He pointed to the massive screen on the wall, which now displayed a live feed from CNN with a chyron that read, Developing story. Tense racial standoff delays flight at O'Hare. A disembodied voice from the legal department crackled over a speakerphone. Do we know who she is? The entire room went quiet. The question was not about Whitney Ashford. They had a file 6 inches thick on her. The question was about the woman she had tried to displace, the woman who stood her ground with such unnerving strategic calm. Who was Celine Monroe? A quick search of their passenger database showed she was a high-value customer, But her file was curiously thin, almost redacted. It was a blank space where there should have been data. Tension in the cabin thickened. The captain's voice finally returned, this time over the intercom, tight and strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a ground delay as we coordinate with our operations team. We appreciate your patience. The passengers groaned, but their frustration was not just about the delay, it was about the injustice. Back at headquarters, the general counsel, a woman with a reputation for brutal pragmatism, laid out the stakes. This is a code red risk scenario. Forget a disgruntled passenger lawsuit. We are now looking at massive discrimination liability, a full-blown civil rights investigation from the Department of Transportation, and a potential review from the FAA. The financial exposure is catastrophic. Another executive, the head of marketing, cut in. His voice panicked. She doesn't need to sue us. The internet is already prosecuting, and the verdict is guilty. The consequences were already cascading. On the ground at O'Hare, news vans were pulling up outside the terminal. In the boardroom, the CFO, a man named Donovan, looked like he was going to be sick. He had just gotten off the phone with the lead banker for their upcoming multi-billion-dollar partnership with a socially conscious tech giant, a deal meant to secure the airline's future for years to come. The deal was now on life support. "They're monitoring the situation," Donovan quoted, his voice shaking. "We all know what that means. If the narrative that we are a company that tolerates racism sticks, they will walk. That deal will evaporate." He slammed his fist on the polished mahogany table. "Do you all understand what is at stake here? This isn't just bad press. This is a multi-year revenue projection going up in smoke because of one passenger in seat 2A. Everyone understood. The fate of the company was currently sitting on the tarmac, being decided by a woman they could not identify and a crisis they could not control. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the outside world was beginning to bleed in. A young man scrolling through his newsfeed read aloud, his voice full of awe. "Holy crap. It's the top story on the BBC News app. They're covering it live." Whitney stiffened. "BBC? That's insane," over a seating dispute. But the man just shook his head, looking at her with something between pity and contempt. It stopped being about the seat the moment you said "you people." The color drained from Whitney's face. She looked around and saw it for the first time. The open disdain, the judgment in the eyes of her fellow passengers. She was no longer a victim. She was the villain. The captain re-emerged from the cockpit, his face pale and drawn. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed by our corporate office to hold at the gate. Departure is delayed indefinitely until this matter is fully resolved." The cabin buzzed louder, but through it all, Celine remained preternaturally still, a portrait of calm certainty. She did not need to shout. The world outside was already shouting for her. At headquarters, the acting CEO of Ascension Airways, a man named Conrad, who was completely unaware that the woman at the center of this firestorm owned a controlling interest in his company, was pacing his office like a caged lion. "Fix it," he roared at his team over a conference call. "I don't care how you do it. Offer her a lifetime of free flights. Fire the damn captain. Just stop the bleeding before we lose the Phoenix deal." But the bleeding could not be stopped. The wound was too deep. The hashtags had hit #1 on global trending lists. Rival airlines were being tagged by customers demanding to know what their policies were. Advocacy groups were pinging lawmakers demanding congressional hearings. The cost of this incident was no longer being measured in the price of a first-class ticket. It was being measured in the billions. Celine, silent amidst the chaos she had orchestrated with her stillness, allowed herself a brief glance at her phone. A single encrypted message had come through from her private chief of staff. "Media requests are overwhelming. Instructions?" Her fingers hovered over the screen, then typed a single chilling line. "Not yet. Let them underestimate me a little longer." It was another hint of her true power. Subtle, precise, and utterly confident. She was not scrambling for a solution like the airline's executives. She was waiting, watching, calculating the perfect moment to checkmate. In the boardroom, the general counsel finally voiced the unthinkable fear that was beginning to dawn on everyone. What if she's more than just a passenger? Heads turned. The buzzing stopped. "What do you mean?" Conrad demanded. The lawyer swallowed hard. "I mean, think about it. She hasn't raised her voice. She hasn't made a single threat. She hasn't demanded compensation. She is just waiting. Only someone who knows they hold all the cards waits that calmly." The room grew cold with a terrible premonition. They all knew he was right. This was not the behavior of a victim. This was the behavior of a predator. And on the tarmac, in a pressurized cabin filled with restless passengers and glowing phones, Celine Monroe folded her arms, her eyes steady. She could already feel the panic in that distant glass tower. She knew the contracts, the stock price, the reputations hanging in the balance. And she knew that what waited beyond this cabin would not just shake the passengers, it would shatter an entire industry. The cabin had become a pressure cooker. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were participants, live tweeting their own confinement, giving interviews to reporters via text. The story was now their story too. Whitney Ashford had shrunk into her seat, her face a pale, blotchy mess. The defiant smirk was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed terror of someone watching their own public execution. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from her husband, her lawyer, her publicist, a frantic chorus she was too paralyzed to answer. Celine, in contrast, finally sat down, not in 3C, but in her rightful place, seat 2A. She placed her bag under the seat in front of her with a calm, deliberate motion. Her posture was regal, her face unreadable. It was as if the chaos swirling around her was nothing more than a mild, uninteresting weather pattern. And then her phone lit up. It was not a text or a call. It was a secured notification from a proprietary application. She unlocked the screen with a facial scan, typed in a short alphanumeric code, and pressed a single digital button. The screen glowed with a simple, terrifying message. CEO override verified, Ascension Airways Global Command. A passenger in 2C, who had been craning his neck the whole time, gasped loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. He could not make out the words, but he saw the interface. It was not a passenger app. It looked like an admin panel, like something from a NASA control room. Why did her phone have options no customer should ever see? Dominic, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline, managed to zoom in on her screen for a split second. His viewers went ballistic. What the hell was that? CEO override? No fucking way. Is she a hacker? A government agent? Who is this woman? Celine did not offer an explanation. She did not have to. She tapped another icon on the screen. A simple command, Flight 928, return to gate, immediate. Authorization, Monroe Alpha 1. Seconds later in this cockpit, Captain Voss's radio crackled to life with a sound he had never heard outside of a simulator. It was the unmistakable tone of a corporate-level override, a command that superseded even his authority as captain. A digitized voice spoke, cold and clear. Flight 928, this is Ascension Command. You are ordered to return to the gate immediately. Acknowledge. The captain's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked through the small cockpit window back into the cabin, his gaze landing on the calm, composed woman in seat 2A. And in that instant, the terrifying, impossible truth began to dawn on him. His voice, when it came over the intercom, was tight with shock and fear. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just received instructions from our corporate headquarters. We will be returning to the gate. A wave of confusion washed over the passengers. What's happening? Did she do that? And then Celine finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a queen addressing her court. It cut through the stunned silence, clear and precise. I suppose, she began, her gaze slowly sweeping over the cabin before landing with devastating finality on Whitney, that I should introduce myself properly. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. My name is Celine Monroe. I am the majority shareholder and the chairwoman of the board of Ascension Airways. She let that sink in, watching Whitney's face go from pale to utterly bloodless. Then she delivered the final crushing blow. Which means, Mrs. Ashford, that this isn't just my seat, this is my plane. The reaction was a sonic boom of pure shock, gasps, disbelieving laughter. Phones were thrust high into the air as if in offering. Whitney's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish drowning on dry land. Her true identity did not just change the situation, it detonated it. Dominic's viewer count went supernova. The clip, "This is my plane," flew across the internet, a viral missile. The captions were breathless. Passenger reveals she owns the airline. CEO grounds her own flight after racist encounter. The world was not just watching, it was devouring the story. Miles away in that gleaming Chicago boardroom, the executives stared at a pirated feed of Dominic's live stream on their main screen. They watched the scene unfold in horrified silence. One of them, the CFO, whispered the unthinkable truth. She's the owner, the silent partner, the one they call the architect. Another buried his face in his hands. She's been on that plane the entire time. The irony was not just painful, it was apocalyptic. They had been scrambling to contain a story, not realizing the protagonist had the power to burn the entire company to ash and salt the earth. The CFO rubbed his temples, a migraine exploding behind his eyes. If she turns this on us, the stock won't just crater, it will cease to exist. Too late, in after-hours trading, Ascension shares were already in a nosedive. Booking cancellations were flooding the system, lighting up the sales dashboard like a Christmas tree in hell. The ripple effect was now an earthquake, and they were at the epicenter. Whitney finally found her voice. It was a pathetic, cracked whisper. I, I didn't know who you were. Celine's expression was not triumphant. It was something far more profound. It was weary. That, she said, her voice laced with a deep, ancient sadness, is the entire problem. You didn't need to know who I was. All you needed to do was respect that I was a human being with a valid boarding pass. That should have been enough, but for you, it wasn't. The simple, devastating truth of it rang through the cabin like a church bell. Passengers nodded slowly. The older couple in row 4 were now holding hands, tears welling in their eyes. The man whispered to his wife, "Finally, someone said it so plain." Dominic's audience swelled again. Commenters were losing their minds. "This is history. Teach them, Celine. I am literally sobbing watching this. And this is why Black Crown Chronicles exists, because when power reveals itself not with rage, but with righteous, undeniable truth, the entire world stops to listen. On the ground, newsrooms were in a frenzy. CNN, Fox News, the BBC, they all scrapped their planned segments. The Washington Post was about to publish Elena Vargas's explosive first-hand account with the headline, "Black Chairwoman Grounds Her Own Flight After Passengers' Racist Refusal to Move." It would become the biggest story on the planet. It would become a legend. Whitney crumbled completely. She clutched her Birkin bag like a life raft, her body trembling. "I didn't mean it. I was just upset." Celine's eyes stayed locked on hers. "You didn't mean to get caught? There is a difference." The line landed like a judge's final sentence. Dominic's viewers clipped it instantly. A man 2 rows back leaned into the aisle. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for not letting this go." Her nod was small but affirming. At headquarters, the corporate panic had deepened into existential dread. The multi-billion-dollar Phoenix deal was officially dead. The tech company's CEO had already issued a curt public statement. "We are appalled by the events on Flight 928. Our company values do not align with any organization that exhibits systemic bias at any level." Conrad, the acting CEO, looked at his silent, terrified team. "She's going to use this to gut us," he muttered. "Every weakness, every old complaint, every skeleton in our closet, she's going to drag it all into the sunlight." The brutal irony was that he still thought of himself as the CEO, but he was just an operator, a caretaker. The true power, the architect of the entire empire, was sitting calmly in seat 2A, letting the world watch as the old guard choked on its own poison. The atmosphere on this plane had transformed. The nervous tension was gone, replaced by a sense of awe. Passengers were not just watching a drama, they felt they were witnessing history. Some began to clap, a slow, spreading applause. Others just mouthed the words, "Thank you." Whitney shrank under the weight of it all. Her entitlement dissolved, leaving only a pathetic, exposed core of prejudice. She was no longer a platinum elite member. She was a meme, a cautionary tale, a symbol of arrogance undone. The captain approached Celine again, his face sheet white. "Ms. Monroe, chairwoman, I had no idea. I assure you, if I had known." She raised a single hand, silencing him. Not with anger, but with a grace that was somehow more intimidating. "You don't need to assure me, Captain. You need to assure every single passenger who flies on this airline from this day forward that what happened here today will never, ever happen again." His shame was captured by 100 phones. By the time the aircraft finally rolled back to the gate, the consequences had already spiraled into a global phenomenon. Ascension stock had shed significant value in after-hours trading. Rival airlines were issuing frantic statements pledging diversity and equity reviews. Civil rights groups were calling for a boycott and congressional hearings, and Whitney Ashford sat trembling, her empire of inherited privilege collapsing in the most public way imaginable. The plane came to a final stop. Through the window, the jet bridge was a gauntlet of flashing lights. Cameras waited. The world waited. Celine gathered her belongings slowly, each movement deliberate and freighted with meaning. She stood and looked down one last time at the broken woman in the seat next to her. "This was never about who I am," she said softly. "It was about who you assumed I wasn't." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, dignity intact, power unmasked. The world had seen a black woman ground a flight with a quiet word and a tap on her phone. Now they were about to see what would happen when she turned that same power on an entire industry. By the time Celine Monroe stepped off Flight 928, the world outside was already a roaring bonfire of her making. The jet bridge was a chaotic tunnel of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Microphones were thrust toward, questions overlapping into a single desperate roar. She said nothing. She walked through the storm with the same unnerving calm she had held in the cabin. Her silence was more powerful than any statement. Within hours, the story was inescapable. The shaky phone footage from the flight was no longer just on social media. It was playing on a continuous loop on every major news network across the globe. Anchors with solemn faces narrated the clips. A shocking confrontation in the skies. A black woman told she doesn't belong reveals she owns the entire airline. The moment a CEO grounded her own plane in the face of blatant racism. The view counts exploded. The internet had already rendered its verdict. The crisis had become a movement, and the movement was about to force a revolution. In Washington, D.C., the reaction was instantaneous. Lawmakers, seeing the viral tide, issued statements of outrage. Congressional committees announced they would be launching immediate hearings into discrimination practices in the airline industry. Civil rights organizations issued press releases, no longer just expressing outrage, but laying out a list of non-negotiable demands for structural and systemic reform. At the FAA headquarters, regulators huddled in emergency meetings, their eyes glued to the same viral videos. If the chairwoman of the board was treated this way, what in God's name is happening to ordinary passengers every single day? One official asked the silent room. Investigations were launched immediately. Across the industry, panic set in. The CEOs of Delta, United, and American all convened urgent crisis calls. Their PR teams worked around the clock, crafting carefully worded statements about their unwavering commitment to diversity and inclusion. But the public saw through the corporate jargon. If Ascension, whose own chairwoman had just exposed the rot from within, was forced to change, every other airline would be dragged along with it. The ripple effect was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. At Ascension's Chicago headquarters, the remaining executives faced Celine for the first time since the reveal. She walked into the boardroom with the same quiet, deliberate power she had had in the aisle of that plane. They stood as she entered, a reflexive sign of deference that was thick with fear. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "You have all seen the videos. You have read the headlines. You have seen the stock price. This is no longer about one passenger's appalling behavior or one flight crew's failure. This is about a corporate culture so broken that it allowed this to happen in the first place." The room was utterly silent. No one dared to breathe too loudly. "You," she continued, her gaze sweeping over them, "preside over a system that trains its employees to de-escalate by asking the person with the legitimate right to be somewhere to make themselves smaller. You call it a compromise. The world has now seen it for what it truly is, systemic bias, and we are not going to bury this under a mountain of apologies and free flight vouchers." One of the directors, a man who had been with the company for decades, shifted uneasily. "With all due respect, Chairwoman Monroe, the financial damage is staggering. Bookings are down sharply. The stock has lost billions in market value. We are hemorrhaging money." Celine's eyes were like chips of obsidian. "Good," she said, the single word landing like a physical blow. "Pain forces change. If this company is to survive, it will not be by patching the holes, it will be by tearing it down to the foundations and rebuilding it on a principle of uncompromising dignity." The story continued to metastasize online. Hashtags multiplied. Petitions demanding the firing of Captain Voss and a lifetime ban for Whitney Ashford garnered millions of signatures. Celebrities and public figures weighed in. An A-list actor with a massive following tweeted, "Celine Monroe is a masterclass in power and grace. All hail the Queen." A tech billionaire wrote, "The airline industry just got its overdue wake-up call. Accountability is the new bottom line." The incident was no longer a news story. It was a cultural touchstone. Advocacy groups used the clips as training materials. Churches and community centers played the videos during meetings. Parents showed the footage to their children. A real-world lesson that dignity was worth more than a quiet life. This was a reckoning. At the New York Stock Exchange, the entire airline sector slid downward as analysts began to speculate about the systemic risk of similar incidents occurring on other carriers. One influential market commentator put it bluntly, "Celine Monroe didn't just ground a flight, she may have just grounded an entire industry's worth of excuses." The markets are starting to price in a new kind of risk, the cost of injustice. What happens when the stock market begins to reward dignity instead of just dividends? Inside Ascension, the purge was swift and brutal. Training programs were not just redesigned, they were scrapped and rebuilt from scratch by a new team of diversity and ethics experts. The old complaint system, which was designed to bury grievances, was replaced with a new transparent, public-facing dashboard. Executives who had long resisted meaningful reform were given generous severance packages and shown the door. But Celine pushed further. She convened an unprecedented cross-industry summit, summoning the leaders of her fiercest competitors along with regulators, union heads, and civil rights advocates. Standing at a podium before a wall of cameras, her voice resonated with undeniable authority. "This was never about Ascension Airways alone, Bao," she declared. "What happened on Flight 928 happens in quieter, undocumented ways every single day, in every airport, on every airline. The only difference is that this time, the victim happened to have the power to pull back the curtain for the whole world to see. But real, lasting change will not come from one viral moment. It will come from a complete structural overhaul that protects every single passenger, regardless of who they are, what they look like, or what class their ticket is for." The applause was thunderous. Back in homes across the country, people watched and they felt seen. Stories began to pour out online, a flood of shared experiences. "I was asked to move so a white couple could sit together. They questioned my credit card in the first-class lounge. They assumed I was the nanny, not the mother." The hashtags became threads of testimony, a collective archive of 1,000 quiet humiliations. The world was realizing that Celine's experience was not an anomaly. It was the rule finally brought to light. Of course, the pushback came. Industry lobbyists screamed about the costs of implementing new regulations. Cable news commentators sneered, trying to frame it as an overreaction. "Is this really discrimination, or just a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media?" one pundit asked. Celine addressed it head-on in a primetime interview, her gaze never wavering from the camera. "When a person in a position of perceived authority dismisses someone they perceive to be beneath them, that is prejudice. When a system trains its employees to prioritize the comfort of the entitled over the rights of the legitimate, that is discrimination. And when a corporation consistently ignores or buries complaints from marginalized customers, that is systemic." What the world saw on Flight 928 was not a misunderstanding. It was the truth, finally dragged out into the light. Her clarity was unassailable. Later, concrete reforms began to materialize. A federal task force was formed to draft a new passenger's Bill of Rights. Ascension announced its new public complaint system, and its competitors were shamed into matching it. And every time an executive grumbled about the cost, Celine's words echoed back, "Pain forces change." As for Whitney Ashford, her world had utterly collapsed. Her real estate firm lost its biggest clients. Prestigious charities quietly removed her from their boards. The woman who once sat so smugly in seat 2A was now a pariah, hiding from the paparazzi, her name forever synonymous with arrogance brought low. The passengers who had witnessed the event became minor celebrities in their own right, giving interviews confirming Celine's calm and dignity. Each account added another layer to the legend that was forming around her. She had become more than a chairwoman, she was a symbol. And yet Celine herself never claimed victory. In an interview, when a journalist asked if she felt vindicated, she replied with a line that would once again go viral. "Vindication implies the fight is over," she said simply. "It's not. We are just beginning our ascent." The answer lit up social media feeds, replayed with inspiring music and powerful hashtags. People found strength in it. Teachers quoted it in classrooms, pastors in sermons, parents at the dinner table. The crisis had become a movement. The movement had become reform. And the question was no longer if the system would change, but how profoundly it would be transformed by the woman who refused to.